So integration testing, that's when you're testing multiple components, right? But pragmatically speaking, it's when you're testing, when it's not just unit testing, it's not just testing things, just testing classes in your application in memory without deploying them. When you say integration testing, there's a database, maybe there's a database involved, maybe you have to deploy it to a container, maybe it's calling some web services. Okay, so that's integration testing. Now, and it's important that you have integration testing is essential. A lot of times when you're going through a tutorial or training on test-driven development, it only talks about only unit testing is covered, but there's so many issues that you can't see in just unit testing. You really need to write tests at some point that include the database that where it's deployed to a web container. It's actually calling uh, something outside of just the JVM. So the problem with integration testing is they're always much more complicated because you have to set up the database, then the calls to the data, each test will overwrite the data of the database so that it will spoil the other tests. So you have to figure a way to make sure that the tests don't interfere with each other, even if they're writing to maybe the same database, right? You have to deploy. There's input output. The calls have to go through a network. They have to read and write from disk. It's complicated and it's slow, right? The setup is complicated and it's slow to the running time of the tests are slow. So in unit tests, even if you're running 1,000 unit tests, you can get all of those done in 1 second, even if your machine isn't very powerful. But with even a modest integration test suite, it's not unheard of that the whole integration test suite might take hours to do one run. All right. So one of the disadvantages of slow test, so it's disruptive to the dev workflow, right? Because you want to be able to code something and verify right away if you broke it. So it's essential to have unit tests, right? Because unit tests, you're done in a second and then you can move on. But if you're also running integration tests, then you won't you'll be if you have integration tests in the mix, then you won't be running your tests often. Okay, you'll probably delay running your tests because the tests take a long time. If the tests even take 5 minutes to run, not much worse if it's hours, but even if the tests take 1 minute to run, you won't run it often because it will just be disruptive to your flow. If you run unit tests and integration tests together, they'll be very disruptive to your flow. So integration tests are usually run separately and less frequently than unit tests because they're slow. So when you're doing your dev work, you want to make sure you didn't introduce any bugs. So maybe as soon as you have something, maybe every 5 minutes or so, you're running your unit tests, but not so your integration tests. Maybe your integration tests, you'll run it much less frequently, maybe once a day, or maybe you let your continuous integration server take care of the integration tests if they really take a long time. Now, what are test containers? Test containers address the problem of complexity in setting up various software. So you want to set up you have to install a database, you have to set up Selenium, set it up to hook it up to a specific browser. You have to set up a web container, right? So in order to run integration tests properly, all of these things need to be installed and configured, right, on the machine that's running the test. Okay, so it's a hassle. It's also tough to manage, right? Because you have to give instructions to each developer. Okay, this is how you set up your environment, and your usual experience, it takes a while to set up environments, right? Sometimes it can take days or even weeks to set up the dev environment because they have to install, they have to configure the schema, whatever, right? And every time there's a change, everybody has to um, fix their environments again, right? Another problem with integration tests, when you're modifying data, like when you're changing data into the database, the one test will interfere with the other, right? So nagbago na yung data, the next test, it's expecting the data to be different. Puputok na yung next test kahit wala namang bug, right? So I remember when I was years ago spending the night at the office hunting for a bug, yun pala wala palang bug, yung data lang yung data lang sa database ay mali. So the solution, we use Docker. Okay? We use Docker to quickly launch software without having to install it. All right? And so that reduces the complexity of setting up your environment. You just need to make sure you have enough memory in your machine. And then to avoid tests interfering with one another, we just launch a new container instead of having to erase data or having to set up and tear down data in the database all the time. Let's just use separate databases using Docker, right? What I used to do, I used a tool before called dbunit to manage setting up data and then tearing down data. But now that we have Docker, why not just each test will have its own database, RDBMS instance. And then another, before I get into the demo, we have to limit the overlap between the scope of tests, right? So mock tests can get complicated, and then integration tests can get even more complicated, right? Note that a lot of people, they try to cram all the concerns into one test, right? So unit tests on the domain have their place versus mock tests, which would use Mockito. If you're doing Java, you're using Mockito or whatever to create your mock tests, your unit tests for your controllers and other things. And then, so you have unit tests for your domain, you use Mockito for unit tests on your controllers, or if you're using services, the unit tests on your services, you use Mockito. And then integration tests, and then of course integration tests when you on the same controllers or services, pero it's really calling the real stuff. So a lot of developers, they try to cram too much scope into each test. So if it's business logic, make sure that it's just unit tests on the domain. Okay, don't try to test business logic in the mock test or the integration test. So the mock tests will just check if natawag ba to? It was this repository method called? Did this parameter get passed into this to this repository, right? It just checks if the flow of the calls in a controller method or a service method was called. And then the integration test, it will check if the proper data was actually saved or modified onto the database. But don't try to do. It's going to be too much effort, and it will be brittle if you try to test business logic in your mock test and your integration tests. Okay, so hiwalay dapat yun. So don't try to cram too much scope in each test. So you have to be clear to yourself the scope that you need to test so that you don't get scope creep in your test. So let's hop straight to the demo. As usual, I use my enlistment application. So my enlistment application looks like this. So these are the students. They get to enlist in sections. Say Meredith Gray wants to enlist this section. It gets added to her list of sections. And then if there's a conflict, we get an error message, right? Let's see if there's any section here that, well, let me see what other conflicts. Missing prerequisites. Let's see if I can simulate the having enlisted in because one of the things that this does is prevent one of the things that this does is preventing too many students enlisting in a section. I'm not sure if I can simulate it here. Maybe all the sections have enough space. All right. Yeah. So anyway, I can't. I'm not able to simulate here. But one of the rules that this system has is, if, for example, a section the capacity of the section is only 40 people, right? You know, the usual when you're trying to enlist in a section, di ba? Unahan kung maraming gustong mag-enlist. Kasi may maximum sila. So one of the rules that this system enforces is dapat hindi sumobra sa number of sa capacity ng section. Kung 40 lang yung pwedeng mag-enlist sa section, then only 40 people will be able to enlist, right? So that's one of the rules. All right. So that works, but only on a single thread, right? So we don't know. So we have a unit test here. Let me shift to my IDE. All right. So here, when the student enlists, there's a check to make sure, if we go here to the section class, there's a check that makes sure that the section doesn't exceed the capacity, right? So kung sumobra siya sa capacity ng room, magto-throw siya ng exception. So bawal yung sumobra sa capacity. And then we have a unit test for that. Okay, so let me see if I can remember where. I think student test yata. Okay, we have a unit test, list within room capacity, and then enlist exceeding room capacity, right? So we have tests that show that this is working, right? It will prevent excess capacity from being enlisted in the room, right? But what do you think? But do you think this behavior? If we go here again, so ito yung guard, right? And then if you look at the guard code, it just checks if the occupancy of the room is already greater than or here is greater than or equal to the capacity. Do you think this will work in production kapag multi-threaded na? So obviously this works on a single thread. Pero kung kunyari 40 students, kunyari 39 na yung nag-enlist, 40 yung maximum. And so there's only one slot left. And then 100 students try to enlist in the section at the same time. Do you think this guard will work? Right? Sabay-sabay yung threads pumasok dito sa guard na to. Right? All of the threads will see na, uy, 39 pa, pwede pa ako. Tapos makakalusot. And then makikita na lang ng registrar na 100 yung students na naka-enlist sa section. Right? Diba? So tawag dyan, race condition. Diba? So we have an idea that it probably won't work. It probably won't work in production. So it's not enough that we have unit tests that are working on a single thread. We have to simulate it in conditions that are similar to production, right? So maybe we can use some sort of in the code we can use synchronized blocks. We can use locks, right? We can use reentrant locks. You think that will work, right? If in this code we use reentrant locks or synchronized blocks, okay na kaya yun? Will that work? Is that enough to prevent multiple students from enlisting? Right. if we do that in say in this section class or the student class, problema, what if there's multiple instances of the section object, right? And that happens in a real application, right? Multiple instances of the section object are instantiated by the application. So even if you create synchronized blocks or reentrant locks on the section object, kung multiple objects yung ma-instantiate, wala rin, baliwala, right? So you figure out another way, you do it somewhere else, you create the lock at the level of the service or at the level of the a service or a controller so that it's a singleton. But what happens if yeah, that's what I mentioned, semaphores, reentrant locks. But what happens if you have multiple applications, right? Multiple application instances, right? So it works in one application when you just have one application. But today, of course, with the cloud, you could be instantiating on the fly. Oh, mabigat na, we need to instantiate another instance, right? So maybe you'll have 3 or 4 application instances hitting a single database, right? So even if you implement, regardless where you create a singleton to make sure that it's only happening in one place in the code, even if you're using semaphores, reentrant locks, synchronized blocks, wala rin if you have multiple application instances, right? So what do we do, right? So we have to figure that out. How are we gonna we have to get the database involved because only the database it's only the database that will be able to implement it's only the database that you have to do the whatever synchronization that you're going to do, you got to involve the database because the database record is the only thing that we can be sure is where there's only a single instance of it, right? So so let's figure it out. Let's first of all, let's start with the problem of separating the integration tests with the unit test. So here, let me show you my Gradle my so I'm using Gradle Kotlin DSL, which is kind of a mistake because there's ang hirap maghanap ng makokopyahan because usually the things you copy are in the ordinary, the Groovy version. Anyway, so one of the plugins I installed is this, see, test sets. All right, the test sets plugin. So, and that makes it easy to separate your test sets. And in particular, it creates a separate test set for integration tests. All right. So here in diba, so my unit tests are here in the usual test directory. And then my integration tests are here in the integration test directory. So test sets, the test sets plugin sets that up for me, right? So that's more convenient than what I used to do in Maven. All right. So let's create a simple integration test for enlistment and canceling, right? Okay, let's so let me go to my enlist controller. So normally instead of instead of having a suffix with test, a lot of times the convention is integration tests end with an IT. All right. So different organizations use different conventions, but what I tend to see in common is instead of calling it a test, the ending of unit test ends in test, and the ending of an integration test ends in IT. All right. So let's write our first very simple integration test. So given a student in the database, right? So given there's a student end section in the DB, right? End section in the DB. When okay, so a student, so enlistment, a student and a section, they have to be existing, right? In the database. And then there's a post method on the controller that it sends in our system. There's a path called enlist, right? So when the post method on path / enlist is invoked with parameters, let's say for the section ID matching the record in the DB, and I have an enum called user action, and then if user action and list is passed in, because if you look at the controller method, Control Shift, right? So one of the parameters is the enum user action to tell the controller whether it's an enlist or a cancel. So we pass it, it goes in with a student object in session corresponding to the student object. Student record in the DB. So note, we're not talking about business logic. We're actually talking about records. Okay, so it's then a new record in the student. So there's a table called student sections. If we open the DB browser, okay, so there's a table called student sections. Every time an enlistment happens, dito nagkakaroon ng bagong record dito. So if the enlistment succeeds, there should be a new record in the student sections. In the student sections table containing the corresponding student number and section ID. Okay. So now let's figure out how to make this happen, right? So let's start by let's use JDBC template to make sure the student and the section are present. Okay. So all right. So we'll use JDBC template to to insert, to make sure that the student and the section are in the DB, right? So let me just copy this from my existing from my notes. I'll just copy this para hindi tayo tumagal. All right. So so ito insert natin si I already have some I have a test util class that just contains some constants. So here I have default student number, so we'll just use the number 10. And then we'll just say whatever default room name. And then so we also insert a room, a subject, and then now that we have a room, a subject, and we can create a section. Okay, so default section ID. Again, I have a class for just to hold some constants. All right, so default section ID, and then the schedule is Mondays, Thursday, 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. All right. Okay, so my section, so we've created the givens, section and student, right? So dapat itong student number and section ID, kung successful yung enlistment, we should be able to find it in the record, right? We should be able to find it in the student section table. May insert siya, right? So siguro so let's call Mock MVC okay, so that we can invoke the post method, right? So I'll add another. So here I'll add Mock MVC. All right, and then let me copy what I've already done in my notes. Oh, I need to one of the things that we need to set up is there's a student object. So naka-log in na si Meredith Gray, right? Or whatever student. Si student number 10 naka-log in na. All right. So we need to have we actually need to have fetch a student. So dapat meron ding we use the student repository to fetch a student from the student object from the database. Okay. Word private student. All right. All right. So let's start by fetching that student from the repository because that object needs to be in session para logged in na yung student. All right. So let me just copy from my notes here para hindi matagal. All right. So yan, kunin natin si student using student repository. Okay, we pass in that default student number, student number 10. And then now we call Mock MVC to post to the enlist path, and then we put the student attribute, the session attribute, yung student, para naka-login na si student. And then sa parameter, yung parameter na ipapass, yung section ID lang, right? Because the student ID, of course, is here in the session. All right. And then yun, enlist. Okay, so mag-enlist. And then to assert, in order to assert, we need to find out if na insert nga siya sa student section table. All right, so this is what we'll use for the assertion. We're going to use JDBC template again. And then we're going to use JDBC template again. And then the expected count is 1, right? 1 yung expected count natin. And then if there is a single, because we're starting from an empty table, right? So if there is a single row that actually the count is, it has to match the where clause, right? Ano ba yung where clause natin? Where student number matches the default student number and section ID matches default section ID. All right. So so that's unique. So if there's only one, so if there's one count of that, successful tayo. Kung 0, ibig sabihin hindi na enlist. Kung more than 1, problema yan. It shouldn't be, hindi dapat more than 1. Okay, so let's see if this works. Okay, let's see if it works. Is it too small, the font? Do I need to make the font bigger? Or nababasa naman? All right, so it works. Okay. Okay, so ano, nakapag-insert. All right, so syempre makalat. We'll see later on if we can refactor later, because of course our tests need to be readable in order to serve as documentation. The font's not small, not too small. Everybody can read the font. Okay, so we've done enlisting. Let's create another simple test, cancellation. Okay, so let's create another test where we'll call na magka-cancel naman. See, it shouldn't be too different from enlisting. Ang magbabago lang naman is instead of enlist, dapat cancel, and then dapat meron na siyang row. This row should be in the database already, and then ang mangyayari, instead of 1, dapat maging 0, right? Okay. So all right, let me set this up. So again, there's a default student and default section. So ano, duplicate code, we need to factor that out later. We need to refactor. And section and student already enrolled in section. All right. So let's insert let's see, insert into this table, student sections. Let me consult my notes. Student number. Ano isa? Section ID. Tapos, ano yun? So, dapat meron na siyang default student number. And then default section ID. All right, I think that's right. Okay, so that's the setup. And then yung when clause natin, it's similar, only this is going to be cancel, right? So this should be cancel. Everything else is the same. And then our assertion is then no record in the students should be found. Okay, so this should be 0. Right. So let's see if this works. Okay, it works. But now let's try running the tests together. Let's see if they still work, even if we run all the tests, both tests together. No, sorry, wrong. Dapat si integration test yung tatakbo ko. Okay, the first one works, the second one doesn't work, right? And it's because duplicate key meron ng student number, right? So ito, issue. So we need to figure out, oh, this test has to use this student number, this test has to use that student number. So it gets complicated, right? Um, so uh, so no, this isn't in memory yet. This is no, this isn't in memory. Um, this is a real database, kaya sila nagbabanggaan, right? Um, so, so yeah, so there's a question kung if the data is in memory. So no, this is a real database. Nagbabanggaan yung mga data. Okay? So before I used to use DB unit. So ang ginagawa ni DB unit, it will insert, it will drop the tables concerned, it will insert data into the database, and then it will run each test, and then after that it will clean up, and then okay. So that works. DB unit is fine, pero ang pwede na, I suppose the more modern approach is to use Docker na lang. So let's just, for every test, bigyan natin ng sariling Docker container, right? And then set up the database para hindi sila magbanggaan, right? So so in so as one of our dependencies, we we include test containers. Okay, so here I want a test container for Postgres. All right, so sinama ko lang as a dependency, right? So ito yung test containers dependency ko, and then sinama ko yung test containers for Postgres, and then some other dependencies so that the test containers will work with JUnit 5, right? So ang gagawin ni test container, okay, ano bang kailangan version ng Docker? You know, I don't have to worry about installing the right version. When there's a new guy, hindi ko kailangan ikwento, uy, install ka ng ganitong version ng ano. I just have to type it into the code what version of Postgres I want, right? So gawin natin ngayon. Um, so So isama ko i-annotate ko yung class with test containers. All right. And then I'll ito this is just to say na every time a test is run, ano dirty na yung application context, and therefore I want a new application context after every run of each test, para it will create a new Docker instance. If you want to share a single Docker instance, you don't have to add this. Pero ito, I don't want it to share a single instance. Pero kung kunyari, you want to optimize your test, pwede naman mag-share ng Docker instance. But in this case, I want to avoid having them share a Docker instance. All right. Each test will have its own Docker instance. All right. So now, I want it to create how I want it to set up kanya-kanyang Docker. Wait, I'm looking for it in my notes. Saan ko nilagay yun? Wait, hanapin ko muna sa code ko. Hindi ko na makita yung where I set up the here. Okay. So here, I'll set, sasabihin ko lang, Control C. So here, sasabihin ko lang, ito yung container ko. So I'm now using the test container library. Okay, gusto ko ng Postgres SQL container. And then, anong version ng Postgres? Gusto ko version 14. I'll just pass it in as a string. And then, I'll already configure it with yung, I'll just say the database name and username and password. I'll just make it all test para simple. Okay. So I already configured the container. So hindi ko na kailangan sabihin sa teammates ko, oh, create ka muna ng database, tapos ito yung user, ito yung name ng database, right? I just write it in the code para they just have to run the test. They don't have to worry about it. Also, di ba meron din to override yung sa application context ng Spring. I'll also add ito yung dynamic property source. So itong mga application context na application.properties na properties, I override it. Okay, so ito yung magiging spring.datasource.url, ito yung spring.datasource.password, ito yung yung setting sa ddl-auto. All right. So again, I don't have to worry about the setup of my teammates. I already set it up here, right? I just have to do it once in the code, and then wala na yung my teammates don't have to worry about it, right? So now, let's see if this fixes the problem. So now each test will run in a separate will have its own DB, right? Let's hope this works. I'm praying to the demo gods to make sure it works. Ayun, so nagda-download na siya ng Docker container and then launching it, right? So una mabagal kasi magda-download siya ng Docker container, but after that, pag andun na yung container sa disk mo, ayan, so they're not interfering with each other anymore. Okay? And it's a real database. It's not hindi yung ginagawa ng iba, they'll use say H2 for their database testing, pero syempre iba si H2, iba si Postgres, right? It's not exactly the same, right? So here you can use the exact same database that you're using in production. If it's Postgres 14, then Postgres 14, right? Yun. So that is test containers. Any questions on test containers? Walang tanong? Sige. So anyway, let me know if you have any questions. So before I move on, mag-refactor muna ako kasi syempre ang kalat, there's so much duplicate code. So I'll probably create a method. I'll call it yung setup, right? I'll call So I'll create a method. So this is duplicate code, right? So I'll create a method called insert default student and section. All right. Para mawala yung duplicate code. And then tawagin ko na lang tong insert default student and section para hindi pa ulit-ulit. Ito yung sa enlist. Alright. Ito yung sa cancel. Alright. Of course, when you refactor, you make sure you didn't break anything. Sige. No questions while I'm refactoring. Just making sure I didn't break anything. So see, it's only two integration tests ang bagal na. No? All right. And then, yung sa dulo din, tanggalin ko yung duplicate code, yung pag-check na kung ilang rows yung meron. So I'll create another method here. I'll call this assert default student is enlisted in default section. Okay, so kung true, ang expected count ay 1. Pag false, ang expected count ay 0. Right? So ito, palitan ko ng, so pwede kong palitan ng method again, para mas malinis. And then here, I'll also replace this. Gagawin ko. All right. So at least mas madali nang intindihin tong code. Let me check if I broke anything. Okay. So now the next thing, so hopefully that's, I didn't break anything in refactoring. So now we go to the question of yung sinabi kong yung testing for multithreaded, pag sabay-sabay yung threads, kung okay pa siya, right? So let's create a thread, a test that does yung multiple yung multiple yung sabay-sabay yung pag enlist, right? So here, so I'll call this enlist concurrent separate section instances representing same record beyond capacity. Tama ba yan? The given is we will have a section na kaya niya lang i-accommodate is 1 student. Okay, so it's a very small section. The capacity is 1. When each student enlists in, and then we'll have several students try to enlist. Then each student enlists in a separate section instance. Only one should be able to enlist successfully. All right. So I created some, I'll copy some of the methods I already created ahead of time para to save on time. Let me copy my notes here. All right. All right. So this one is for inserting many students. I'll insert 20 students, right? Mag-insert ako ng 20 students. And then uh, also I'll create a section with some capacity. All right. So here, let me create the and then I'll also have this method. Wait, these methods. Wait, I'll show you these. This method and this class. Okay, so this class is what I called it the enlistment thread. It will create so for each of the students trying to enlist in that one section, it will perform an enlist using Mock MVC, right? So kanya-kanyang thread. And then maybe there's a better way. I've seen some libraries that I have yet to study. But what I'm doing is it will create 20 threads. Okay, one per student, 20 threads. Tapos, sabay-sabay silang mag-enlist. Okay, syempre wrong spelling pa ako. Enlistment, hindi enlist. Anyway, I won't change the spelling na lang. Okay? So, it will start 20 threads all at the same time, and then it will try to enlist. All right. So, let me go back to our unit test, and then asan ka? Unit test. Okay. So let me just copy paste this in the interest of time. All right. So, sorry, I forgot that method for asserting. It will assert the number of. So here I need a method to assert the number of students successfully enlisted. So dapat isa lang yung mag-enlist, right? So let's see if this works. It will launch 20 threads and try to enlist them all at the same time. Okay. Any questions so far?
We have 2 questions, sir.
Yeah. Nagpa-persist po ba sa memory? Ito, depende sa config mo. So, ginawa ko that's why I set up this, yung annotation ko na dirty context para bagong application context every run ng test. Okay, so since bago application context, gagawa siya ng bagong instance ng test container. If you want to reuse the same test container, tanggalin mo lang to. All right. But of course, then you have to make sure the tests in the class don't interfere with each other. You can use dbunit to do that. Did I answer the question? All right. All right, so nag-fail, right? Nag-fail siya. Tignan natin sa dulo. Test failed. Ilan yung na-enlist? Bakit iba yung, teka. That's not what I was expecting. Wait, I think I have some leftover code from the solution. Let me make sure I delete the solution. Section. But let me. Energy section. I think I pura ko naman lahat. Okay. Sige. Let me try everything again. Maybe I'll clean ko muna. And then let me run the integration. Let's run all the integration tests. Dapat walang version kasi hindi pa tayo umaabot doon. Bagal. Nagpo-persist mo na, sir, yung DB test container is the solution to isolate test when we're having integration. Wow, my prod environment? Don't test in a prod. I hope I understood the question. Don't test in prod. You're testing either the tests run in test server, a CI server, test server. Don't run any tests in your production server. Okay. Preparation SQL. Okay, there is a bad SQL. I have a bad SQL statement, right? Okay, here we go. All right, so this is premature. There shouldn't be that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, kaya pala. Let's run this again. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. Some of the solution is already there. Okay. Okay. So that never test on your prod server. Okay, don't never please. Okay. So do I get the right error now? Okay, again I'm getting sorry. This one is okay. Line. Oops. So here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. Okay. Ito pala. Sorry, that's part of the solution again. Let me rerun this again. Masyadong advanced. There it's launching the Postgres, Docker. So I hope tama na yung error. Ayun. So expected, isa lang yung ma-enlist pero 10 yung naka-enlist, right? So yun, nakalusot siya sa guard natin. So now, how do we do this? So what a lot of people do, they use synchronized blocks, they use So nangyayari, nagpipila yung mga threads, right? So na prevent yung race condition, nag-crash naman yung server or so nag-slow down yung server kasi pila-pila yung mga connections sa pila-pila yung connections. Only one thread at a time is handling these enlistment. All right, so sobrang bagal ng server. So instead of pessimistic locking using synchronized blocks or semaphores, right? Reentrant locks. Let's use optimistic locking. So si JPA, di ba, may version. All right. So ang ginagawa ng version, magdadagdag tayo ng field that will keep track of the version every time si section, every time na modify si section, magi-increment si version. And then what will happen um, pag magse-save na, right? So na-update na si section, nadagdagan ng student. Pag isa-save, bago i-save, i-check muna kung yung version na nasa object, siya rin yung version na nasa database. So kunyari, yung version na nasa object ay 50 and then yung version sa database 50 din. Ay, okay. So fresh pa yung data dito, pwedeng save. Pero paano kung yung yung version number sa object ay 50 pero yung version sa database 51 na, 52. Ibig sabihin na-update yung yung version. So bawal i-save kasi hindi na fresh yung data. Okay? So we have to find a way to refresh the data before i-save kasi baka mamaya yung magka-race condition nga na isa-save niya, akala niya 39 pa lang yung naka-enlist sa kanya, yun pala sumobra na, right? So, just a couple of weeks ago, I was teaching how to do it na mano-mano using JDBC to some students, to some trainees kasi yun ang hiningi ng company nila. But of course, if you use JPA, it's very simple. Okay, so punta tayo. So, gagawa lang tayo ng field. So magdagdag lang tayo ng field. Let's call it section. Private final. Let's call it version because it's the version. Private final int version equals 0. Okay. And then let's just add version annotation. Okay. So so much simpler in daming magic these days. And then just for good measure, let's give it a default value of 0, right? Yan. So meron nang siyang magdadadag siya ng version column. And then every time ma-modify itong object na to, it will mag-i-increment yung version number, right? So now let's see if that's enough to make it work. In case, wait, are there 3 inserts or example? How does I? Okay. So now it's working. Okay. So notice, if we look at the stack trace, so this is good exceptions. These are the exceptions we want. It's throwing object optimistic locking failure exception. So ibig sabihin, nakikita niya na stale na siya, gumalaw na yung version number sa database, pero yung version number sa object hindi pa siya na-increment. So i-reject niya, hindi niya isa-save sa database yung kung ano yung object. Okay, row was updated or deleted by another transaction. Stale object state exception. So that's what we want, diba? Okay. We're preventing stale data from being saved. So down at the bottom, after all that, asan yung ating where is our assertion? Let's go here. Dapat meron tayong well, pumasa. So walang error. So pumasa siya. Only one. So successful. Only one student was able to enlist. So there's a question. In case we need to cover transactional scenarios, there are 3 inserts. Or for example, how does does it cover scenarios such as dirty data, phantom inserts? Transaction. Wait. Asan yung controller ko? So, and list controller. Sorry, I forgot to make this transactional. Wait. So everything should be transactional. See, let me think about your question later on. Okay. Did I tama ba? Okay. Let me see if yeah, so it should be transactional. Baka napansin nyo, hindi ako gumagamit ng service. So eye-opener sa akin yung domain-driven design ni Eric Evans. Galit sila sa service layer, sila ni Martin Fowler. Ayaw nilang may service layer. So Eric Evans defines application services and domain services which are different from the service layer. Okay, so dapat daw walang service layer. Okay, so it's still working. So good. So bawal na, pero let's see kung yung success scenario naman. So yun yung yung scenario na dapat hindi sumobra. Paano kung pero if if there's enough slots ba makaka-enlist yung mga students. Okay, so let's have another test. Okay, dapat may happy path tayo. Balik tayo sa oops. Okay. So magdagdag tayo ng happy path dito. Dito naman may enough capacity. So dapat 20 there's enough capacity in the section. So the section has enough room for 20 students. So dapat lahat sila makaka-enroll. Okay? So let's see if this will work. Okay? So dapat lahat makaka-enroll, 'di ba? Kasi there's 20 slots in the section and then 20 students will enlist in the section. So let's see what will happen. All right. So notice, let's see what happened. So yeah, so obviously minsan stale yung data kasi sabay-sabay nga. Notice down at the bottom, expected 20 yung makaka-enlist. Pero 3 lang. Okay? So that's why it's always important meron kang happy path test kasi baka mamaya nagsasucceed yung cases na may exception tapos yung happy path hindi gumagana. All right, expected 20, actual 3. All right, so even if may space, reject simply because the objects are stale. All right, so what Spring provides is so dapat ang kakabit ni version dapat nagre-retry ka. So dati, so when I used to teach na JDBC lang, mano-mano, maglo-loop. to do a retry. With Spring, meron tayong meron siyang library for retrying. So you just have to add the dependency, yung Spring retry, and then sa controller, sa post method, alright, dito sa post method, idagdag natin yung retryable. Let me consult my notes again. So here, we just add this annotation na if the not here, sorry, not the exception handler. Dito sa dito pala. Dito sa post mapping, if this exception is thrown, uulit siya. Okay? So magre-retry siya. All right. Is that enough to do it? So uulit yung pag-call nito. Let's see if it's enough. Let's run all the integration tests. Well, let's maybe not all the integration tests mabagal. Let's just run for now, let's just run this one. Okay. Let's see if it works. Yung tanong about transaction, well, just assert what you need to assert if you want to make sure, if you want, just check at the end if nag-roll back ba. So if pag no roll back, you should check if the data is in the way you're expecting dun ka sa assertion, di ba? So notice it's still failing. Let's see why it's still failing. All right. Dumami ng konti. It's still retrying. Pero kulang sa exception. Tanggalin ko yung exception handler para we have a better idea what's going on. Tanggalin ko tong si exception handler muna para makita natin ang bakit hindi siya nakalusot, so that makita natin yung stack trace. While we're waiting, any questions? Any other questions? So I hope the person that asked about the transactional scenarios, I hope that answers. Just, whatever you're expecting, that's what you check in the assertion. Whatever state the database should be. Okay, it's still, so here, let's see what exception it's throwing. It's throwing period overlap. Okay? Bakit nagkaka-period overlap? It's the same section. Bakit? We're only listing in one section, right? Why is there a period overlap? Does anybody know? Ba't nagkaka-period overlap? Punta tayo sa controller. Ito. Okay. So period overlap yung nagiging problema. All right. And the reason why nagkaka-period overlap, so if you weren't able to guess, kasi si student, di ba, isa-save, andun na siya sa section, andun na yung section sa loob ng student, right? It's already part of the enlisted sections ni student. Tapos nung nag-retry, we tried to insert the section again. So nakita ng, when we were using the enlist method of student, um, meron siyang checking for conflict. So akala niya bagong section, not the same section. Chinek niya, uy, baka naman magka-conflict siya sa schedule. Eh syempre, same section. So ni-reject, nag-exception siya na same schedule. So let's add let's add a statement here na if the sections of the student already contains the new section, just do nothing, right? Do nothing. All right. So let's see if that's still working. If that solves the problem. Of course, these tests don't replace manual testing. After everything's working, dapat i-test nyo na rin manually kasi minsan may mga lumalabas na hindi nahuhuli sa automated tests. All right. It's still failing, kulang. Why is it failing? Ano naman yung sorry. Return should return, right? It should. Sorry, my mistake. Rerun the failed test. Okay, so nag-work na siya. Okay. And then let me reinstate the exception handler. Right. Let's see if everything's working. Let's run everything, both integration tests and unit tests. So medyo matagal to. All the unit tests. See, ang bilis ng unit tests, pero integration test, that's when tumakbo ba yung integration test? Hindi niya tinakbo yung integration test. Let me run the integration test. This one is failing. And let's see why it's failing. This one is failing because of a certain number. Okay. Wait, tanggalin ko naman yung let me remove this again. What's the exception here? What was 10? Okay, so there's another exception that I must have forgotten to do something, but um, I hope anyway. I think I don't I don't have I don't think I'll have time to debug it, and maybe it will be boring for you just to watch me figure out what's wrong. But uh, the demo gods aren't helping me today. But clear ba yung ano um everything that we yung goals ko natin for today, separating integration tests, using test containers to separate the data, that giving each test its own database, and also handling race conditions using version and retriable. Is that clear? All right, so good. That's it for my demo. I hope it was clear.